Elara Quinn sat in her office, the soft hum of the air conditioner blending with the scratch of her pen on paper. She watched Julian Stone fidget in the chair across from her, the faint lines of worry etched into his young face. His hands twisted nervously in his lap, and every so often, his gaze flicked to the floor as though he feared that it might open and swallow him whole. Yet it wasn't Julian's anxiety that made her heart tighten. It was the unspoken story she recognized beneath it. She had seen that look before, in herself, mirrored in the eyes of a child left to fend for herself in a world that had decided she wasn't worth keeping. Growing up, Elara had learned early the cruel lesson of absence. Her parents, or the people who had brought her into the world, had chosen a life of opulence over responsibility. She had no memories of their hands guiding hers, no lullabies whispered in the dark, no warmth to cling to. Instead, she had the flickering glow of a television screen showing the life she would never have. Her family, celebrated and adored, their smiles immortalized in magazine spreads and television interviews. She could remember the way her mother's laugh sounded in the advertisement she watched, the way her father's eyes crinkled with charm as he accepted awards she was too small to understand. And she had remembered, too, the silence that greeted her in the small apartment she called home, the cold void that filled the spaces where love should have been. It had hardened her, yes, but it had also taught her empathy. She could read pain with precision, not just because she studied it in her textbooks, but because she had lived it, breathed it, survived it. It was the very thing that had led her to become a psychologist, to dedicate herself to understanding the shadows in other people's hearts. And yet, she had never imagined that the path of her career would lead her here, to Julian Stone. His file had arrived that morning. Julian Stone, 17, issues with anxiety and anger management, parental neglect suspected. She had skimmed it quickly, noting the standard background information. But something about the name, something about the combination of lineage and circumstance, caused her heart to skip. Not immediately, not consciously, but beneath the surface, a memory stirred. Julian shifted, breaking her reverie. I don't know why I even came here, he muttered. It's not like anyone really cares what I think anyway. His voice was low, tinged with bitterness. Elara leaned forward slightly, keeping her expression neutral, professional. I'm here to listen, she said softly. Sometimes, even saying things out loud can help us understand them better. He nodded, but she could see the wall behind his eyes. That same wall she had built so many years ago to keep the world from knowing how much it had hurt her. And then, as he shifted again, a small framed photo on the corner of his desk caught her eye. A family portrait, perfectly posed, perfectly polished, the kind of image meant to hide cracks and secrets. She blinked, her breath catching, and in a single instant, she saw the faces she had spent her childhood watching on television. Faces she had never thought she would see in her office, faces she had never expected to confront in person. Her hand tightened around the pen. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with recognition. This was him. The child of the people who had abandoned her. The life she had been denied now staring back at her through their son. Elara's lips curved into a small, imperceptible smile, one that spoke of quiet fury, of long-buried pain, and of a plan that was only just beginning to take shape. Because she had learned to survive without them. And now, finally, it was time they learned to regret. Julian sat across from Elara, his gaze darting nervously between the corners of the room, as though danger lurked behind the soft beige walls. He tapped a foot against the floor, a rapid staccato that betrayed the restlessness of a mind trapped in its own anxiety. Elara observed him quietly, her hands folded neatly on her lap. Every subtle movement, every tiny twitch told a story, a language she had learned to read long before she earned her degree. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, she said softly, letting her words hang in the air like a gentle invitation. We can start slow. Julian's eyes flicked to her, suspicion mingled with curiosity. Slow? He echoed. You think I'm just going to spill my life story because you say so? She smiled faintly. Not at all. You'll share when you're ready. The only thing I ask is honesty, with yourself first, with me second. He exhaled sharply and slumped back into the chair, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. My parents, they don't get it. Nothing I do is ever right. His voice cracked on the last word, betraying a vulnerability he clearly didn't want anyone to see. Elara nodded, letting the silence stretch a moment longer. This was what she lived for, the cracks in the armor, the small openings where she could reach in and touch the hurt that others ignored. And yet, something else simmered beneath her calm exterior, a recognition she couldn't yet voice aloud. As the sessions continued over the next few days, she began piecing together Julian's world. His parents were influential, charismatic, and carefully curated for public appearances. Yet behind closed doors, there was a coldness, a distance that mirrored the experiences she herself had endured as a child. The more Julian spoke, the more she saw familiar patterns. Subtle manipulation, unrealistic expectations, and a lack of genuine affection. Elara found herself keeping careful notes, documenting not only Julian's behavior but the dynamics he described. She remained professional, yet her mind raced with unbidden thoughts. Could it be? She had glimpsed the faces in a photograph in the office the first day, the same faces she had spent her childhood longing for. She had dismissed it as coincidence, yet now every word Julian spoke, every story of privilege and neglect, made the pieces fall into place. One afternoon, Julian described a dinner where his father had berated him for not performing up to standard in school, and how his mother had quietly laughed, as though embarrassed by his discomfort. Elara's pulse quickened. She had known this dynamic intimately. She had known it as the child who was left behind, whose very existence had been erased by the same couple Julian spoke of. When she asked gently, "Do you think your parents understand how much this affects you?" Julian's gaze dropped, his hands twisting together tightly. "They don't even notice me most days," he muttered. "I'm just here. Like furniture." Furniture. The word echoed in Elara's mind, a cruel reflection of how she had been treated, discarded, left in the shadows while they celebrated themselves to the world. Her professional voice remained steady, calm, reassuring. "You're not invisible," she said softly. "You deserve to be seen, to be heard." Julian hesitated, then finally met her eyes. There was a flicker of trust there, fragile and tentative. For the first time, he seemed to believe it, even if only a little. Elara's stomach tightened as she stared at him. She knew now, with terrifying clarity, whose son he was. She knew the parents who had abandoned her, the people who had never once acknowledged her existence. And now, fate had placed their child directly in her care, unaware that the woman guiding him through pain was the very child they had left behind. For a brief moment, the office was silent save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Elara's mind raced with possibilities, strategies, and the faint, dangerous thrill of the reckoning that had finally come within reach. Because now, she wasn't just a therapist. She was the daughter they had forgotten. The child they had abandoned. And though they didn't recognize her yet, she remembered everything. And she would make them remember too. The first time Elara truly saw him, really saw him, she felt a jolt that no amount of training could have prepared her for. Julian Stone wasn't just another patient with anxiety. He was a living, breathing link to the life she had been denied. Sitting there in her office, slouched in the chair, fidgeting with his hands, he looked so much like them. The same sharp jawline, the same restless energy, the same defiance masked as indifference. Her heart thumped in a strange rhythm, half excitement, half rage, half grief. She had spent her childhood absorbing their faces from glossy magazines, from television interviews, imagining what it would be like to be noticed, to be held, to belong. And now, here was their child, sitting across from her, unaware of the collision of past and present. It was a photograph on his desk that confirmed it. A family portrait, immaculately posed, perfectly polished, a cruel image of everything she had longed for and never received. Her eyes traced each familiar curve and contour, lingering on the faces she had memorized as a child. Her mother's precise smile, the cold elegance of her father, their pride shining in every frame. And suddenly it hit her. Julian was theirs. Their son. Their pride, their joy, their oblivious heir. Elara's breath caught. Every memory she had buried, the emptiness of her first birthday, the loneliness of holidays spent in a cramped apartment while they paraded in magazines, the sharp pang of longing every time she saw their smiling faces on television, surged forward, raw and relentless. She clenched her fists in her lap, forcing herself to remain calm. This was a professional setting. She was a psychologist. She had studied detachment, studied patience, studied control. And yet, control felt like a fragile barrier, one that trembled with every detail Julian revealed about his home life. I can't stand them sometimes," Julian said quietly, his eyes downcast. They just don't care. Not really. And I feel like I'm always disappointing them, even when I try to be perfect." Elara swallowed, nodding slowly. "It sounds like you've been carrying a lot of weight on your own. That's exhausting." Her voice was gentle, carefully measured, concealing the storm beneath. No one should have to feel invisible, especially not within their own family. Julian shifted slightly, as if the words finally landed somewhere safe inside him. "It's like, I exist only to make them look good. If I fail, I disappear. And if I succeed, it's only because they can show me off. It's never me." Every word pierced her like a shard of glass. She had felt that. Every part of it. And for the first time in her adult life, she allowed herself a brief, dangerous thought. They were finally within her reach. She didn't speak. She let him speak, observing the cracks in his armor, the patterns that mirrored her own. She realized that the very dysfunction that had defined her childhood had been passed down, unaltered, to this boy. And if she played her cards carefully, she could make them see, through Julian, the weight of the pain they had caused. The professional mask she wore was flawless. Calm. Compassionate. Competent. But behind it, her mind was already plotting, cataloging, calculating. She would be precise. She would be subtle. She would not let her anger betray her. Yet she allowed herself one private acknowledgement. Revenge would taste like justice. By the end of the session, Julian left slightly lighter than he had arrived, unaware that the woman who had given him a fragment of relief was the same child his parents had abandoned. Elara sat back in her chair, staring at the empty office and the fading echo of Julian's footsteps. She felt a mixture of elation and sorrow, a dangerous cocktail she had learned to harness. She whispered softly to herself, a promise and a warning all in one. You taught me pain. I'll teach you regret. And in that moment, she knew with chilling certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. Elara closed the file on Julian Stone and leaned back in her chair, letting the quiet hum of the office settle around her. She had spent the morning listening, asking careful questions, and guiding him to reveal more than he intended. And all the while, the truth sat like a cold weight in her chest. Julian was the son of the parents who had abandoned her, unaware that the child they had left behind now held subtle control over the boy's healing. Therapy, she reminded herself, was a tool. It was her craft, her art. She could navigate the fragile landscape of Julian's emotions without ever betraying her own agenda. She had honed the ability to enter a person's mind and understand the pathways of their pain. And now, those pathways could be a bridge to the very people who had hurt her. She began to pay attention not only to Julian but to the family he described. Her sessions became a quiet reconnaissance. Every story he told, the offhanded comment from his mother, the sharp reprimand from his father, the social pressures they enforced, painted a clearer picture of their lives. She could see their flaws, their arrogance, and most importantly, the cracks they carefully hid from the public eye. You're saying they don't listen, she said one afternoon, her tone gentle, inviting, probing. Even when you tell them how you feel, they, what? Dismiss it? Ignore it? Julian nodded slowly. Yeah. They smile, maybe nod, and then it's like nothing ever happened. Like I never said a word. It's like I don't even exist unless they want something. Elara's jaw tightened subtly. The phrasing, the pain, it all mirrored her own childhood, the exact neglect she had internalized, the exact loneliness she had carried. She let the session continue, letting Julian explore his frustrations, his anger, his longing. Outside of the office, she began to observe, in her own discreet way, the lives of her biological parents. She followed their social profiles, caught glimpses of charity events, photos of lavish dinners, press releases praising their successes. They were the same people she had long remembered, polished, self-assured, unaware that a ghost from their past had returned to silently undermine their illusion of perfection. Back in therapy, she introduced small nudges into Julian's self-perception, guiding him to question, to reflect, to see patterns without him realizing he was being influenced. She spoke of boundaries, self-worth, and the subtle ways people can manipulate without overt cruelty. She smiled when he connected the dots himself, unaware that she was subtly preparing him to recognize the consequences of his parents' negligence. And yet, she remained cautious. She did not act on impulse. Revenge required precision, patience. She allowed herself quiet moments of reflection, remembering the cold apartments of her childhood, the ache of being invisible, the longing she had carried for a family who never wanted her. Each memory was a brushstroke in the intricate plan forming in her mind. One evening, as she prepared for the next session, she found herself lingering on a photograph of Julian she had taken, a casual snapshot during a laughing moment when he let his guard down. There was an innocence there, a vulnerability she could not destroy. Her revenge, she reminded herself, was not against Julian. He was the bridge, the instrument through which her parents would finally see the weight of their choices. The shadows of the past were long, and they were patient. Elara knew that. And now, she would play within those shadows, unseen but undeniable, guiding events in subtle, deliberate ways. As Julian left that day, she sat in the empty office and whispered softly, more to herself than to anyone else. Watch carefully. Every action has a consequence. And now, the consequences are theirs. And for the first time in years, the thought made her chest swell, not with the emptiness of childhood, but with the thrill of quiet power, the promise of reckoning, and the slow, deliberate shaping of the regret that would one day consume them. Elara watched from her car as Julian exited the house, a backpack slung over one shoulder, the weight of unspoken frustrations evident in the slump of his posture. From this distance, she could observe the subtle cracks in the Stone household that Julian had described in her sessions. A husband distracted by work, a wife laughing at things that weren't funny, a family that prided itself on perfection while quietly ignoring the very person who made them look complete. It was exhilarating and terrifying at the same time. Exhilarating because for the first time, she held influence over a family whose past decisions had scarred her life. Terrifying because power, even wielded carefully, had a tendency to twist and consume those who underestimated it. But Elara's control was precise, calculated. She wasn't reckless. She was patient. Back in the office, Julian had begun to open more during their sessions. He spoke of dinners where his parents praised his grades but criticized his every social interaction. He described evenings spent in silence while his parents entertained guests, ignoring him completely, except when they needed to showcase a proud moment to outsiders. Each story was a mirror of the pain Elara had known in her youth. "You feel invisible to them," Elara said one afternoon, her voice calm, professional, but layered with something Julian couldn't yet identify. "Like your presence doesn't really matter unless it benefits them." Julian nodded slowly. "Yeah, exactly. Sometimes I wonder if they even remember I exist." Elara leaned forward slightly, her fingers steepled, careful to maintain the boundary of therapist and patient. "You're learning something important, though," she said softly. "Even if they don't notice, you can start noticing yourself. You can recognize your worth without waiting for their approval." Julian frowned, a mixture of curiosity and confusion on his face. I think I want that. But I don't know how." Her lips curved into the smallest, imperceptible smile. That was the first seed. She didn't need to manipulate Julian directly to punish his parents. All she had to do was guide him to awareness, to strength. And as he grew more confident, every subtle act of his autonomy would ripple through the Stone family like a quiet earthquake. Outside the office, she had begun arranging encounters and circumstances that would gently destabilize their polished lives. She made discreet calls suggesting social events Julian could attend, subtly guiding situations that would reveal the parents' neglect to friends, colleagues, or social circles. Small, almost invisible nudges, invitations declined, tiny embarrassments, moments that would linger in the subconscious of the adults who had once ignored her. She reminded herself constantly, this wasn't cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was measured. It was justice. And it was the only way to confront the people who had caused her pain without revealing herself prematurely. At home, in the quiet of her apartment, she reviewed her notes and strategies. Every detail Julian had shared, every story he had hesitated to tell, was catalogued. Every weakness, every hidden arrogance of the Stones' public persona, was noted. She allowed herself a rare moment to imagine their faces when the truth came to light, the realization that the child they had discarded had returned, grown, intelligent, and poised to make them feel the weight of their past actions. It was intoxicating. But the most dangerous part, Elara knew, was maintaining patience. The first taste of subtle power was always seductive, but rushing it would ruin everything. She had to nurture the seeds of regret carefully, allow them to grow unseen, until the moment came when they could no longer ignore the consequences of their neglect. And somewhere deep down, beneath the careful plotting, there was another truth she refused to acknowledge aloud. Julian didn't deserve the collateral damage of her anger. He deserved freedom, validation, and guidance, and she would give him that. But the reckoning for his parents, that would be hers to deliver. Elara closed her notebook and leaned back, letting the tension drain from her shoulders. The pieces were in place. The seeds were planted. And soon, the family who had abandoned her would begin to feel what she had carried for so many years, the quiet, inevitable weight of regret. The first fissures in the Stone family's facade appeared slowly, almost imperceptibly, but Elara noticed every one of them. A subtle hesitation in the way Julian's father, Richard, spoke to his son at dinner. A sharp glance from his mother, Lillian, when a minor social faux pas exposed their neglect in front of colleagues. The cracks were small, almost invisible to the casual observer, but to Elara, they were seismic. She observed from the shadows, careful not to reveal herself. Her influence was indirect, a ghostly hand guiding the inevitable unraveling. Each therapy session had strengthened Julian, giving him the language and courage to challenge the patterns of indifference he had endured. She let him take the lead, allowing his emerging confidence to clash against the meticulously maintained perfection of his parents. "Why do they act like I don't exist?" Julian asked one evening, his voice tight with frustration. Why do they always talk over me, dismiss what I say, like I'm just there for decoration? Elara paused, choosing her words carefully. Because they've always defined value by appearances rather than truth, she said gently. But you have a voice. You're learning how to use it. And when you speak honestly, it can be like a mirror for them. They can't ignore the reflection. Julian frowned thoughtfully. A mirror, huh? Yes, she said, letting a quiet smile touch her lips. Sometimes the most powerful confrontation isn't loud or dramatic. It's subtle. It's in showing them themselves, without them realizing you're doing it. She watched as Julian absorbed the idea, the faint spark of recognition lighting in his eyes. That spark, she knew, could ignite the slow, consuming fire of regret in his parents. She didn't have to act directly. The family's own structure, their need for control and validation, would betray them. The next social gathering at the Stones' estate provided fertile ground. Elara had subtly suggested the event to Julian, highlighting an opportunity to assert himself, to present his opinions, and to quietly challenge the polished image his parents sought to maintain. As predicted, the evening became a subtle battlefield. Julian's comments, confident and articulate, drew attention to the small ways his parents had failed him. Lillian's forced smile tightened, Richard's practiced charm faltered under the unspoken judgment reflected in their son's words. Elara stayed home, monitoring her phone with a professional detachment she only partially maintained. Texts from Julian described the tension, the discomfort, the subtle cracks forming in the veneer of perfection. She allowed herself a momentary thrill, the first real taste of indirect confrontation. And yet, she remained cautious. She could not allow the facade to collapse completely just yet. Patience was essential. The Stones had to feel the discomfort, the growing tension, the creeping realization that they had failed, but not so quickly that they suspected she was the architect behind it all. Later, during a session, Julian's eyes were bright with the unspoken triumph of small victories. They noticed me tonight, he said, almost in disbelief. Not just looking at me, but really noticing. It's weird. It feels like I have power. Elara nodded, her voice calm, measured. You do have power, she affirmed. And the more you understand your own worth, the more influence you gain, not through manipulation, but through truth. People can't hide from the truth forever. Truth, she mused silently, was the most potent weapon. And in the coming weeks, she would wield it like a scalpel, precise and invisible, cutting through the Stone family's illusions until they could no longer ignore the consequences of their neglect. The shadows she had lived in for so long were no longer hers alone. They had become instruments of reckoning, and the child who had abandoned her past had returned, not as a victim, but as the architect of their quiet undoing. And still, they remained blissfully unaware of the storm building just beyond their perception. The night was heavy with anticipation, though no one in the Stone household suspected the storm approaching. The grand chandelier cast glittering reflections across the polished floors, but for Elara, every glimmer seemed like a countdown. She wasn't present physically, yet every move, every decision, every revelation was meticulously orchestrated to converge tonight. Julian stood quietly in the drawing room, his posture calm but electric with the energy of confrontation. His parents, Richard and Lillian, chatted with their usual grace, their eyes glinting with pride and the unawareness of the cracks beginning to spread beneath their feet. They believed the polished surface of their lives could hold against scrutiny, that perfection was a shield strong enough to hide their failures. But perfection, Elara knew, was brittle. Julian began, tentatively at first, recounting small events, dinners where he had been ignored, praise that came with strings, moments of humiliation veiled as guidance. His voice was steady, but the weight behind it made the air thicken. You know, he said quietly, there's something you never taught me, how to feel like I matter. Everything I do, everything I've achieved, has always been measured by what it does for you, not me. Lillian laughed nervously, glancing to Richard for support, but there was none. Julian's word had a mirror-like quality, reflecting the reality they had spent decades avoiding. The room shifted imperceptibly, tension blooming like a shadowed flower in the corners of the glittering space. Then came the moment Elara had waited for. She entered, calm, composed, her presence like a quiet blade sliding into the room. The air seemed to tighten. Richard's eyes flicked to her, a faint recognition stirring, but disbelief held his tongue. Lillian froze, her smile faltering. I think it's time you remember me, Elara said softly, but every word carried the weight of years of absence, of pain, of unspoken grievances. Do you remember the child you abandoned? The silence was instantaneous, deafening. Richard's face paled, his carefully maintained composure cracking. Lillian's hand flew to her mouth, the color draining from her features. Recognition, horror, disbelief, all tangled in the briefest flicker of realization. Julian's gaze shifted between them and Elara, confusion etched across his features. Wait, you're... Yes, Elara interrupted, her voice steady but rich with emotion. I am the child you left behind. The one you chose to forget while you built a life on appearances and admiration. I am the consequence of your neglect, standing here not as a victim, but as someone who has learned, grown, and now guides the reckoning you never expected. Richard's voice cracked. Elara, we didn't. You didn't what? She asked softly, stepping closer, her eyes unflinching. You didn't care? You didn't notice? You didn't even consider that your choices could have consequences beyond yourself. Tears threatened Lillian's composure. We thought it was convenient, Elara said, finishing the thought for her. Yes. It was convenient for you to ignore me, to erase me. But convenience doesn't erase the past. It doesn't erase the pain. And now, it doesn't erase me. Julian's mouth opened, then closed, struggling to process the revelation. He glanced at Elara with a mixture of awe, fear, and gratitude. She had guided him to this moment, and now he could see the truth of his parents' failures for himself. Elara felt the quiet satisfaction of victory, not in cruelty, but in justice. They were forced to confront the life they had abandoned, the consequences of their choices crystallized in the woman standing before them. Her voice softened, almost gentle. You taught me pain. I will teach you regret. Not through harm, but through the truth. And truth is unavoidable. The Stones' elegant home, once a sanctuary of image and illusion, now felt like a cage. Every smile, every charm, every polished gesture held within it the weight of exposure and accountability. And for the first time in decades, they had nowhere to hide. Elara turned her gaze to Julian. You are free now, she said. And you have the right to see your parents as they truly are. But the rest, that reckoning belongs to them. And in that moment, standing tall in the quiet chaos she had orchestrated, Elara felt the final, liberating truth. She was no longer the child abandoned. She was the architect of acknowledgement, the keeper of memory, and the harbinger of the regret they had sown themselves. The following weeks were study in tension, collapse, and quiet victories. The Stone household, once a polished image of wealth and control, had become a theater of fractured emotions and unspoken confrontations. Elara had stepped back now, letting the truth she had revealed settle, and watching as the consequences she had engineered unfolded with meticulous precision. Julian's transformation was the most striking. Freed from the shadow of his parents' approval, he moved through his days with a confidence previously unseen. He questioned decisions, challenged authority, and no longer allowed their dismissive words to shape his sense of self. Each act of autonomy, no matter how small, sent ripples of discomfort through Richard and Lillian, who were unaccustomed to being questioned, much less confronted by the child they had long ignored. You don't understand, Lillian said to Richard one evening, voice tight with frustration as Julian left the room after asserting himself during a dinner conversation. He's changed. I don't know where this courage came from. Richard ran a hand through his hair, his usual calm shattered. It's like, he sees us. Really sees us. And is not afraid to call it out. It's uncomfortable. And we can't control it. That was Elara's quiet triumph. She had not needed to humiliate them directly. She had guided Julian to recognize his own worth, and in doing so, had exposed their failures through the mirror of his emerging strength. The perfection they had curated for decades now showed cracks with every glance, every word, every act of rebellion by their son. Elara observed these developments from a distance, allowing herself a rare moment of reflection. Her own pain, once raw and consuming, had been transformed into something constructive, a force that guided both Julian and the consequences his parents now faced. She felt neither cruelty nor malice in her actions, only a sense of justice, tempered with compassion for the boy who had endured too much. Julian, sensing the shift, began to speak more openly in their sessions. I can't believe it, he said one afternoon, leaning forward in his chair. I never realized how much I let them define me. And now, I feel like I can breathe. Elara smiled, carefully contained, letting him savor the moment. You're seeing the truth for yourself, she said. That freedom is yours. Your parents' past choices don't define you anymore. Their regret is theirs to carry. The Stones, meanwhile, were left to navigate the wreckage of their illusions. Public appearances became strained, their once effortless charm replaced with subtle defensiveness and insecurity. Friends noticed the tension, colleagues whispered, and even social media reflected the cracks that had once been invisible. They had always relied on appearances to mask reality, but now, reality demanded acknowledgement. One evening, Lillian confessed to Richard in private, voice trembling, We failed her. We failed ourselves. How could we not see? Richard's jaw tightened. We didn't just fail her. We failed, all of us. And now, it's permanent. The past can't be rewritten. Elara, watching the unfolding drama from a distance, allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had not sought to destroy. She had not sought revenge through malice. She had sought justice, clarity, and acknowledgement, and the stones were finally confronting the consequences of their neglect. And Julian? He thrived. No longer constrained by invisible chains, he embraced his own identity, his voice, his presence. The child who had been invisible was now seen, fully, undeniably. Elara reflected on the journey, the slow, careful orchestration that had brought them to this point. The shadows of the past were still there, yes, but they no longer held her hostage. She had reclaimed her power, guided another to independence, and forced the architects of her pain to confront themselves. In the quiet of her apartment that night, she allowed herself a deep exhale. The facades were shattered. The truth had been revealed. And for the first time in decades, she felt unburdened, free, and irrevocably whole. The morning sun filtered gently through the blinds of Elara's office, casting long lines of light across the floor. Julian sat across from her, calm and composed, the transformation in him almost palpable. Gone was the hesitant boy who had slouched in his chair, his voice barely above a whisper. In his place was a young man who carried himself with quiet confidence, whose presence no longer trembled under the weight of parental neglect. You've really helped me, Julian said softly, almost in disbelief. I don't think I ever realized I could feel normal. Like I matter, without having to earn it. Elara allowed herself a small smile, genuine and unguarded. You always mattered, she said. You just needed to see it for yourself. No one else could give you that. Not completely. You had to claim it. He nodded, a thoughtful expression on his face. And my parents. I don't hate them, I guess. But I see them differently now. I understand what they were, and what they weren't. That understanding is powerful, Elara said. It allows you to release the burden of their choices. You don't have to carry their neglect anymore. That weight isn't yours. Outside the office, the Stones' lives continued to adjust to the revelation. Richard and Lillian were left to grapple with the consequences of decades of indifference. Their public image had been shaken, and their own guilt was a constant, gnawing presence. But the lessons they had learned were permanent. The child they had abandoned had returned not with vengeance, but with truth, and that truth demanded reflection, accountability, and, perhaps, the first genuine understanding of their mistakes. Elara, meanwhile, felt the quiet closure she had longed for. The pain of abandonment, which had once defined her existence, had been transformed into purpose, justice, and empowerment. She had guided Julian not as a pawn, but as a mentee, allowing him to grow while ensuring that the architects of her pain would finally recognize their failures. Her own journey was complete. The emptiness she had carried since childhood was replaced by a steady, unwavering sense of self. She had confronted her past, reclaimed her agency, and ensured that the lessons of neglect would not remain unacknowledged. Julian stood and extended his hand, a gesture of gratitude and trust. Thank you, Dr. Quinn, for everything. I don't know where I'd be without you. Elara shook his hand, her grip firm but warm. You'd be just fine, she said. You always had it in you. I just helped you see it. As he left the office, Elara watched him walk into the bright light of a future he had earned for himself. She felt a sense of peace, an understanding that her role in his life, and in the reckoning of her parents, was complete. She returned to her desk, opening a journal she had kept since childhood. On the first page, she wrote a simple, declarative line. I am here. I am whole. I am free. Outside, the world continued, unknowing of the quiet storm that had passed through the Stone family and the woman who had once been invisible. Inside, Elara smiled softly, the weight of the past lifted, the shadows behind her finally settling into memory rather than control. She had been abandoned. Yes. But now, she was redeemed, released, and utterly, irrevocably herself. The past could no longer define her. The future, wide and open, awaited, and she would walk into it unafraid. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more original novel stories. And stay tuned, our next story is coming soon.